Thank you.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar about managing corruption risk in markets beyond the EU. My name is William Barnes-Graham and I am the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas. To our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, Ask the Experts forum, and our Export Action Plan tool. You can find all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for international trade, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session. You can ask questions at any point during this webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We have two brilliant speakers today. Leading today's session, we'll have Brook Horowitz from IBLF Global. Brook is the CEO of IBLF Global, an NGO which promotes responsible business practices in emerging and developing markets. He's worked in many of the emerging markets and he was with General Electric in Russia and Eastern Europe throughout most of the 90s. And accompanying Brook, we will have Robert Wilson, a director with Exiger, a consultancy for compliance and risk management. Robert focuses on fraud, bribery and corruption and financial crime investigations, and he was previously head of anti-bribery and corruption investigations at GSK, and before that, a principal investigator at the Serious Fraud Office. But first off, over to you, Brook.
Thank you very much, Will, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So we're going to be talking about managing corruption risk in markets beyond the EU. Clearly, companies are having to reconsider the export markets that they are focused on, and what with Brexit, and it's clear that many of the opportunities are going to be outside of the EU, but these same markets, which are very often growth markets, are also full of risk, and that risk needs to be managed. So that's what our webinar is about today. Next slide, please. I should just mention that this is the first in a series of two sessions. I'm also running a course on the 25th of May with the Institute of Export and International Trade in London, and that will be a physical seminar rather than a webinar, and we'll be talking not only about the risk but the opportunities for emerging markets. So we expect that there'll be a number of people who are looking at these new markets and trying to find out whether it's really for them, and that will be the kind of discussion. For that session on the 25th of May, I will be joined by a number of practitioners from with expertise in China, Vietnam, Russia, and Turkey, all big growth markets which may be of interest. Okay, so next slide, please. The agenda for today, we're going to talk about, first of all, I'd like to define which emerging markets we should be looking at. There are a lot, but not all of them are attractive prospects for British companies, so I'm going to try and focus on a few. I'm going to discuss why corruption has become such a problem in recent times. It doesn't leave the headlines, you'll be aware of that, and it certainly affects any company that is moving into new markets. Then with my colleague Rob Wilson from Exiger, we'll be discussing what are the corruption risks that you are likely to encounter in these markets, and then which UK laws do you need to be aware of, because it's not just a question of the local laws, it's the long arm of the British law that you also have to worry about. There are certain red flags that you should be aware of, and we'll be discussing those. And then finally, is there anything you can do about it if you find yourself in a compromising situation? How can you get out of it? Where do you go to get help? That's our agenda today. Next slide, please. So I think this slide really says it all. I mean, the emerging markets between now and the year 2022 are in full growth, and the EU is static. But not only that, we're leaving the EU, and at the moment we don't know what kind of trade barriers or other obstacles there might be preventing us from being part of the internal market. So whatever the Brexit situation is, the fact of the matter is that growth is not in the EU, or if it is, it's going to be still in the Central and Eastern European new Europe, which is has more growth attached to it than Western Europe. In any case, we're going to be looking outside of the EU for this, for the sake of this webinar. Next, please. So, one estimate of the high growth markets in 2017 points to a diverse group of countries. You can see China. The darker, the bigger the growth on this scale. You can see China. You can see Morocco, Egypt, Kenya, Ghana, Indonesia, and I think that Argentina on the Western Hemisphere there, and they're all high growth. Of course, China, 6.4%, never to be missed. Next slide. And then if you look at the forecast annual growth of the biggest markets, that growth remarkably continues. So China in 2022 is predicted still to be on average at 7%. India, 11%. So, you've got some of these massive markets which are just growing in a huge way. You've got Philippines, you've got Indonesia, even Russia, which is not in anybody's good books, still seeing 4% growth. And then in Latin America, of course, Argentina and Brazil. Next slide. Then the largest markets by the year 2022, again, very similar, but of course we can see, these are in, China is $17,000 billion. I can't quite say it, maybe it's 17 trillion, isn't that right? So China is by far the largest market by the year 2022, and then you've got these BRICS countries and then the MINS countries. You've got Iran there, you've got Nigeria, of course India. So none of this should be a surprise. These are the markets that we hear about all the time, but I'm just reconfirming that these are the markets that we should be looking at if we're going for growth in the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. And of course, here's the crunch. This is the TI Corruption Perception Index, and I've just plotted on this map those same countries that I've just been talking about, and you can see that the scale is basically, if it's dark like Russia is, or like Iran is, then you've got a real problem, because those are markets that are right at the bottom of the TI Corruption Perception Index. You've got Nigeria, Kenya, right at the bottom. The lighter color, well, it's probably mid-level. None of these countries appear in a very light color, other than perhaps Ghana and South Africa, and even they are quite low down on the Corruption Perception Index. Now, you may know about this Corruption Perception Index. It's the only index we've really got, and it is perceptions, and it is trying to, it's an index of indices, and it's looking at how governments behave in those countries. So, it's to do with how public officials behave, and that has a great big bearing on how companies entering these markets can operate, the right to operate, its licenses, its customs, its public procurement. It's a whole host of things that have a massive effect on the way companies, local companies and international companies, including British companies coming in from outside, how they can operate. So you can't ignore this corruption perception index, and if you are considering going in to any new country, you really do need to look at that. It doesn't mean that you can't go into these markets, but you've got to be aware of that risk perception. Next slide, please. And just for the sake of contrast, I'm going to give you another one of these indices, which I actually find quite useful, and it's a little bit less scary than the TI Corruption Perception Index. It's the World Bank Ease of Doing Business. And again, I would always recommend to exporters to take a look at that. It's not measuring corruption, it's measuring a whole list of areas of how easy it is to register a company. It's how to get a construction permit. Is that easy or difficult? In each country, it's a global scale, and there are 14 different measurements, and then the average is brought out here. And again, you see that none of these countries that are high growth are particularly easy for doing business. So again, you've got to be aware of that. Ease of doing business covers a much wider range of issues than just corruption. But when you're doing risk management in new markets, you shouldn't just be looking at corruption. You should be looking at a whole range of issues. And on the 25th of May, by the way, in our seminar, we will be looking at a wider range of issues, not just the corruption issue. Next slide, please. Now, corruption's come up right up the top of the agenda, and in these markets, what are the main issues? Why are we seeing these attractive markets with sometimes highly educated people, wonderful raw material resources, very entrepreneurial cultures? Why are we seeing them hand in hand with corruption? Well, many of them are relatively new countries, especially the former Soviet bloc, and we know that there's a very low tradition of rule of law. So really, if you're trying to get recourse to law to resolve a commercial problem or some other kind of legal issue that you might encounter, or a property issue or an intellectual property issue, sometimes it's very difficult to get judgment because the judges themselves may be corrupt, and that penetrates the whole market. So weak rule of law is clearly a common feature of many of these markets. Some of these, I said, they're new markets or they're new countries, and that's indeed the case. There's several new countries in the former Soviet bloc, in Africa, and some of these are post-conflict economies, Liberia, or they're economies that have come out of some kind of terrible health dilemma, and these are also affect the way the countries are governed. They're just trying to make ends meet, and the people working in government are just like anybody else. They're trying to survive. It's pretty difficult, I think, to be, if one's sympathetic towards these people, it's very difficult to make ends meet in those circumstances, and it often drives people to behavior that they would not like to do very much. There are different business traditions. I remember from my experience in China a few years ago, when I was talking with somebody from one of the ministries about corruption. He said, well, we've been doing corruption for longer than you've been doing business. And there's some truth in that. I mean, this is not only a question of corruption, it's a question of how you do business. You give gifts, you're friendly to people, you have trust, you have old school friends. We have elements of this in our British culture, but especially in the Asia Pacific region, these are much more pronounced, and people must think it's very strange when we come in with our UK Bribery Act and tell them that we can't give them a gift because it would be considered to be unprincipled or even illegal. It's very difficult for people to understand that. They think we're from another galaxy, to quote a recent expression. And then, as I've mentioned before, the former Soviet area, which is a place where I've had quite a lot of experience, the transition from communism has left a very, very poor level of governance in society and in companies. And I think that there's a great big educational thing that is actually happening and has been happening over the last 25 years or so, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it is a generational problem. And quite regrettably, one of the things that's happened is that the younger generation has been brought up in this kind of Wild East environment, and probably they also don't quite know what we talk about. So it's the absence of normal business traditions that is the problem in some of those countries. I mentioned the post-conflict economies, and of course there are huge differentials between rich and poor. The temptation for a very poorly paid government official running a public procurement for millions and millions of pounds, one just wonders how people could possibly resist. Well, they're supposed to, they have to, and it's up to us as investors in these countries or as traders with these countries to resist as well, and to also make clear what our position is. But the differentials between wealth and poverty are tremendous, and that is a recipe for more corruption. And then finally, in many countries, a highly centralized bureaucracy. In a way, the more centralized, the more bureaucratic, the more red tape, the more the opportunities for asking for a bribe. And sometimes one gets the feeling in these countries that the bureaucracy is deliberately adding red tape so that it can ask for the bribe. Next slide, please. It's not just on the market side that we have a problem, though, as companies. The other side of it is that the regulatory and legislative developments that have been taking place in our countries, mostly in the UK and in the US, but also in other West European countries and in Canada, in Australia. There's a lot of new anti-corruption legislation, and Rob will talk more about the UK Bribery Act, but you'll be aware of the big scandal that Rolls-Royce has found itself in. That's a very good example of how the UK Bribery Act is now coming not only into force, but it's being enforced. Next slide, please. There's better enforcement, and the better enforcement is partly to do with better coordination. One of the roles that I've played is to be as a co-chair of the anti-corruption working group of the B20. It's a business advocacy group working with the G20 governments, and what I've been able to see there is very, very extensive and quite surprising cooperation between the G20 countries on anti-corruption issues, on a whole range of issues, and indeed under the Chinese chairmanship of the G20 a couple of years ago, there was a real push for this. And something like the FIFA debacle could not have happened without this better cooperation and enforcement. So you do something wrong in one country, it'll be picked up somewhere else very quickly. And if it's not the British authorities that get you, then it'll be the US authorities or others that are part of this global network of enforcers. Next slide. There's a lot more transparency. I call this technological factors. You'll all be aware of the Panama Papers, and that is a very good example of how technology has allowed whistleblowing to take place. And again, nobody can be protected from that. And as you know, a number of heads of state have been kind of implicitly or explicitly involved in the Panama Papers, or been their misdeeds have been broadcast far and wide. The same can apply to any company that has got stuff going on. Next slide. As I said, there's no impunity anymore. So that's Dilma Rousseff, the ex-president of Brazil, and we see today some elections in South Korea to replace the president of South Korea, who was also impeached for corrupt activities. Again, and I think the message is that there's no impunity even for heads of state, but it also means that you've got to be very aware that in highly corrupt environments there can be changes of regime very quickly, and that will also have an effect on your business. You can't predict it. It's just that you have to build that risk of some kind of insecurity, if you like, into your plans when you are investing or trading with a new market. Next slide. And then finally, I think we've seen well, the Arab Spring, for example, in many other countries, and South Africa, this picture in Russia, more public activism. Those ducks you can see there, those are the ducks that represent the ducks that President Medvedev has got in his duck pond. It's quite interesting, really, that even in a quite closed country, politically closed country like Russia, these kind of demonstrations are happening. Again, the power of the internet and technological advances are allowing people to bypass the restrictions that are happening. Again, you need to know that. You need to understand that context in the markets where you're working. Next slide, please. So that's just a thank you from me, but I'd like to go straight on to the next slide and ask Rob to now go into a little bit more detail about the legal issues that you will be confronting when you're going into these markets. Rob.
Thank you, Brooke. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Wilson. I'm a chartered accountant, and I've been specialising in forensics and investigations for the last going on for 20 years. As Will said at the beginning, I've previously worked for the Serious Fraud Office, so I've investigated some of these crimes from the outset. So hopefully some of that will help me be able to help you understand some of the risks you're going to be facing. I'm currently at a company called Exiger, and we're a governance, risk and compliance consultancy who help businesses with their internal controls, their policies and procedures, and also with third-party due diligence and those kinds of things. So again, it's looking into where the potential risks might lie within your business and looking at how you might mitigate those. So what are the main risks facing small and medium-sized enterprises? Could we go to the next slide, please, Will? Well, basically, you could commit a criminal offence, you could lose a lot of money, and people might not want to do business with you. Now, those three things are things that I don't think are going to form any part of your business plan. And it's the sort of thing that does put people off doing business in jurisdictions where bribery and corruption are a little more rife. But what I want to say is, all risks are, scary before you've got a good plan to mitigate them. And that's what this talks about. So we're going to look at what these risks are specifically, and we'll also talk a little bit about how you can identify the red flags within your own business that really the ones that you should be looking at and addressing. And then I'll come on to some practical tips that you can that you can do when preparing for doing business abroad. So just looking at the criminal offences, and I'll just remind you, I'm not a lawyer, so this shouldn't be taken as legal advice. The UK Bribery Act, as Brook has mentioned, is newish legislation, and it is now being enforced by the Serious Fraud Office. The offences are, as you'd expect, bribery. And what do we mean by bribery? Inducing somebody else, pretty much anywhere in the world, to do something or to not do something that would be in their normal course of business, something that you wouldn't expect them to do. You're incentivizing them somehow by giving a bribe to do something that you wouldn't expect. And it covers all UK companies, all UK individuals, and frankly anyone with doing business in the UK. So it has a very, very broad reach. You will be prosecuted in the UK for bribing anywhere within the world. There's also within it a specific offence of bribing a government official, a foreign government official. Again, that's largely covered by the bribery offences anyway, but it's a specific OECD requirement that we do prevent bribing foreign officials. There's also, and you may have come across this before, it's been much talked about in the press, there's an offence of failing to prevent corruption. So within your organisation, are you doing everything you can to stop your employees bribing other people? And there is a defence against that of having adequate procedures. What are adequate procedures? Well, nobody really knows for certain because it's not been tested in the courts yet, but it's just reasonable, sensible procedures that are proportionate to your size of business and proportionate to the work you're doing in terms of how you encourage your staff, yourselves, not to bribe other people. It should be made clear there's no de minimis in terms of what constitutes a bribe within the UK Bribery Act. So it will cover facilitation payments, as they're called, and these tend to be the smaller payments to maybe customs officials or other low-level officials to just get things done, to get your passport stamped. They are covered by the Bribery Act. I'll come on to the US legislation that's slightly different in a second. But it's worth noting that there is no de minimis, so anything you do that constitutes a bribe is potentially a criminal offence. The US have had their legislation for a little bit longer than us. The FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, has been enforced now for going on 40 years. It's really only been enforced for the last 10 or 15 to any degree, but it is still relevant to UK businesses who have some kind of nexus to the US. So if you are transacting in dollars, in foreign currencies, then you could be caught by the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It does only cover bribery of foreign officials, so it's not just bribery, it wouldn't be bribing a corporate entity. So it's slightly narrower remit than the UK legislation. It also, facilitation payments are sort of allowed, although it's a slightly grey area, provided they're disclosed within your accounts as such. You should also be making yourselves aware of local legislation. You know, is it an offence to bribe in the countries you're in? What is covered by local legislation? I think basically you can't know every bit of legislation everywhere, so it's always good to take advice where you're acting. But I think it's fairly safe to assume that pretty much a bribe anywhere is likely to be a criminal offence. The other one thing I wanted to mention on criminal offences is the UK Fraud Act, which came into force around 2006-07, and it has an offence of fraud by misrepresentation. Now, why do I mention this in terms of corruption? Well, the Serious Fraud Officer said it will use UK fraud legislation where there's, where it's easier for them to do so. And if it's a dishonesty offence, it's when you're misrepresenting perhaps in your accounts that some of your expenses, if these are relating to bribery, if you're describing them as, say, normal expenditure, cost of sales somehow, cost of transport, but it's actually a bribe underneath it, well, that's misrepresenting within your accounts what that money was spent on. And it might be easier for the SFO to look at that slightly narrower offence and to get the evidence on that, rather than to go into the overseas evidence and to work with overseas jurisdictions. So it is something the SFO has said they will use as a tool to try and stamp out corruption. Civil sanctions, well, if you're convicted of bribing, there's always the risk of debarment from bidding on other European or UK contracts. Certainly within government, if you're convicted of a bribery offence, it will be difficult to tender for government work. You're also opening yourself up to customer and competitor litigation. On the back of, there was a case of Innerspec in the UK fairly recently, and a competitor trying to sue them because of the bribes that Innerspec had paid. They were claiming that they weren't able to tender in a free and open way and therefore lost out on a contract that they could have won. Now, Innerspec did actually successfully defend that action, although the judge did make it clear that it was potentially a sound legal claim. It's just that the evidence in that case didn't stack up. So you are putting yourself certainly at financial risk if you do engage in bribery. And that leads on to the potential reputational and brand damage. People may not want to trade with you in the future. Certainly, as everybody else is conducting due diligence on their partners and their joint ventures, you may well be ruled out of working with other people that you've done business with over the years if you are convicted. So, are people targeting companies like yours? Are you the sort of business the serious fraud officer is going after? Well, Smith & Usman is another company that you may have heard of in the papers that was prosecuted by the Serious Fraud Office. It's a small printing company in Eastbourne. It had, and I stress had, a turnover of about 24 million. It paid bribes of around £400,000 in Kenya and Mauritania. And the Serious Fraud Office investigated and obtained convictions against the company, against the sales director, who was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. One of the senior directors, I think the father of the sales director, was also found guilty but received a suspended sentence. The company was fined 2.2 million and turnover dropped from 24 million to 15 million in the following year. So these are the, this is a smallish, medium-sized UK company that's been prosecuted for overseas corruption. So yes, I think all of this is particularly relevant to all of the people listening to this call. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Will. We'll try and identify what are going to be some of the red flags for your businesses. Where should you be looking, and where are you opening yourselves up to the risks that we've just talked about, the risk that you'll be prosecuted? Just take a small sip. Certainly, if you're involved in any kind of overseas government tendering, working with overseas governments, it tends to be more of a risk, partly for the reasons Brooks talked about, partly because pay in the public sector is lower, partly because of the power of the government officials to grant the sort of licenses and permits you might need to do business. It's an area that if you are working within that sector, you need to be alert to the fact that it is often part of the bidding process that the bribes are asked for. Bribes are put forward by competitors, by joint venture partners. Please do excuse me. So where you're tendering for business, what you want to make sure that you're not being asked by the person running the tender that for private payments, for other inducements. When you're having to obtain licenses, does the product that you're selling into the jurisdiction, does it need to meet any technical standards? Does it have to have a permit? Does it need import licenses? If they do, then just look at how you are dealing with the authorizing body that's going to let you take those goods into the country. In terms of customs, how do you get your goods through customs and into the country itself? Customs officials can always be very slow at processing paperwork. Have you got your paperwork fully in order before approaching customs? Has it been checked through? Are you certain you're doing the right thing? Because it's particularly if you're dealing with perishable goods, there's often or time-sensitive deliveries. It's easy for the customs to hold a little bit of power over you and to make a request for those payments. So just think through, where are the risks within my supply chain? Where can I possibly be put upon to pay a bribe to an official? Working with government and development aid, World Bank funding, all the sorts of these areas, again, particularly in developing nations, there's often a pressure to use some of these funds coming into countries for projects to help develop local infrastructure. Are you being asked to do things that are the vanity project for the person running the tender or the procurement director of the company you're trying to sell into? One other risk area I would say is use of third-party agents. Do you fully understand the business practices of the people that you're dealing with in country? Do you use third parties to help you negotiate, to open those doorways for you? If so, do you know what they're doing on your behalf? Because certainly the UK Bribery Act does cover anybody who is acting on your behalf, whether they're employed or they're a third-party agent. So do you really know what those people are doing on your behalf? Have you got a good agreement with them? Can you go and check through, can you audit their behaviours and their practices? Do you actually know the individuals themselves? Have you met with them? Just to gain that understanding and make it clear to them what's acceptable and what's unacceptable business practices on your behalf. I think when you're asked to tender, are there any unusual buyer requests? You know, I remember being asked to tender to do some anti-bribery training for a foreign police force, and we'd set out exactly how long we thought this would take and the type of resources and the people we'd be using to do that training, and we were asked a way into the tender to add a couple of local individuals onto the roster for the training. And we said, well, who are they? What are they going to do? And we were just told, oh, you'll need them. They'll help facilitate things. They'll make it easier. Don't ask any questions. We'll sort out the payment of them. This was for a police force. Clearly, it set alarm bells ringing for us, and we declined to tender in the end. I think sometimes you have to think, is this too culturally endemic? Can I get over the hurdle of bribery in this? And we couldn't bring ourselves to put it forward. We thought, well, even if we do take those people off the tender, there were going to be other problems further down the line. But again, unusual requirements. Are you being required to build a local school or contribute to other local projects while as part of your tender? You want to also look at, are there any other operating costs of getting into the market? Are you being asked to pay to join a local supply group? Are you being asked for any incentives to help you break into this market? Are there fixers who say, well, you won't be able to sell here unless you pay me money? Why is that? Try and find out more about the market itself. Try and speak into the other people who are doing business in that country. Is this a necessity? Is it really something that has to be done, or is it just somebody touting for a bribe? The other areas, marketing and gifts to local individuals. Yes, it's quite common practice in a lot of jurisdictions to be required to give gifts, or people expecting gifts. And I think what you have to look at there is, it's a grey area. Is what you're giving proportionate, reasonable? Is it the sort of thing that that you would be happy being disclosed, or is it something that clearly is going to influence? Looking at the Rolls-Royce case, a Rolls-Royce motor car was bought for the buyer. A Rolls-Royce car is quite a different thing to a bottle of whiskey. So but then again, a bottle of whiskey might be something in a jurisdiction that is significant. So you just have to understand your local market, and you clearly will know that better than me. And the other issue around that is free samples, and certainly with a lot of medical products and other similar things, it's often the case that you'll be asked for white labeled or unlabeled or undocumented free samples that may be used for personal use by the buyers. Yes, of course, samples are going to be required, but is it a disproportionate amount? Is it reasonable in the context of what you're bidding for, what's being asked? If it hit the front page of the Daily Mail, and could you justify it? One thing also worth remembering is that it is an offence to accept bribes. So if you have local partners, if you are advertising for local support, maybe it's contractors for building work in a foreign jurisdiction, Are some of the local firms offering bribes to your employees to favour their company over a competitor? Now, this is exceptionally difficult to understand everything that all of your employees are doing, so it's something that you'll have to take very seriously, but you'll have to know your staff and trust your staff to do the right thing. And that will come down to a point I'll talk about on sort of practical tips in a moment. Could we move over on to the next slide, please, Will? So I just wanted to quickly run through some of the sectors where there are typically a few more issues than others, but these are just examples. Bribery can happen in any kind of industry. But I think typically we've seen a lot of prosecution of offences in the extractors, in the oil and gas sector, in the mining sectors, and it's because we're dealing with high value, high risk products. You also often need licenses and permits, you're dealing with land agencies, you're dealing with planning permissions potentially, and the same goes for construction. You're dealing with the use of labour, the use of possibly local materials and purchasing requirements in country. So all of these things should be highlighting to you. There's potentially risks for people accepting bribes. I think we'll move on to the next slide. Just think about what it would be that in your industry that might be driving people in country to ask or demand bribes. So if you are asked for a bribe, what can you do about it? Well, it can be quite challenging. I don't want to say that this, it's straightforward and that the easiest thing to do is just say, no, I'm not going to pay a bribe and that'll be okay. It's not like that. I appreciate that. But here are some hopefully useful tips that you can build into your business planning and build into your staff training that will help them to understand this is what we do and this is how we do good business. And I think it starts with just documenting your own risk. Like I've been saying, understand exactly how your market and how the country you're working in works, and just set out in your policies and your procedures how you are going to deal with the bribery risk you're facing. You'll do plenty of preparation and planning for the sales conversations, for the bids you're going to have. Just work through a scenario that at any stage of that somebody asks you for a bribe. Just be prepared when you're going into those discussions for somebody who might say, in order to be entered into this bid, I want you to pay me a bribe. What is your response going to be at that stage? And as I say, set those out in your policies and procedures. Have you got a good document that says what's tolerated in your organization? What will be your response? I'm hoping that all of you as businesses have already a fraud risk assessment, and you may well have a fraud response plan as well. Corruption and bribery should be just another aspect of that fraud risk assessment. Slot it in. How are you going to deal with it? How are you going to train your staff to help them understand the UK law, the local laws that they're working in, the markets that they're working in? How are you going to help them understand the response you want them to make when somebody asks them to pay a bribe? How are you going to train them to deal with hospitality, with gifts, with samples? How do they understand what is and isn't acceptable for you, for your risk appetite? And take advice on this. I think talking to your lawyers, talking to your auditors, talking to your internal general counsel if you have one, talking to NGOs and trade associations like Open for Export. These are good ways in. If you want specific advice on the countries you're working in, talk to other people who are dealing in those markets. What are they facing? Who have they been asked to pay bribes to? What have they done about it? Sharing that sort of information is a lot easier these days. There are software solutions as well. There are plenty of platforms out there. I know we have one in terms of helping you assess the risk of third parties. To help you do the due diligence you need to do on the people you're working with, the people you're bidding for work from. What is it likely you're going to face? I think working with a local trade association is a good thing. I think you need to determine whether they're reputable in themselves, but just understanding the market and playing yourself into it in a way that shows that you want to do business with them, but you want to do it in a fair and transparent way. And I think that comes to my next point. if you're asked for bribes, what are you going to do? And I would say the first thing you want to do is document it. Put it down, make a note for yourself what's being asked, and then resist it. Do everything you can. Say, no, I'm afraid we can't pay. Explaining to the person asking why it's illegal, why it could get them into trouble. I think it's always good to ask somebody who's asking for you to pay a bribe to put their request in writing. That tends to put them on the back foot initially. People know this isn't right. And people will therefore not want to put it in writing. If possible, explain you have to speak to their seniors. You'll have to deal with people who have influence over them. If it's possible, make it apparent. If it's in terms of a bid, make it apparent to other people who are bidding that you've been asked for a bribe. It's likely they've been asked for one too. But once you bring it out into the open, it makes it a lot easier for you to deal with it and to take that sort of collective action against any form of bid rigging or requests for bribery. It is always possible to speak to UK law enforcement. It is always possible to talk to UK government and other people. They'll help, they'll advise you on where you might go for somebody to speak to. Obviously, they're not going to approve it. I know, I recall one successful prosecution in the UK where an individual had told the Foreign Office that he'd been asked for bribes and he was going to have to pay them to win the business. And he was clearly advised that it would be against the law, but he took the view that as he'd advised the FCO and they didn't do anything positive to stop him doing it, it was acceptable. The courts found that was not to be the case. I think the final piece of advice is be prepared to turn business away. It's a very difficult thing to do, I know, especially when you're trying to break into a new market. But if the only option is to commit a criminal offence, you do have to ask yourself, is this business that I really want? So I think just in summary of what I've been talking through there, I think it's, have you got the appropriate and relevant policies and procedures in place? Do you understand your own risk in your own markets? Have you trained your people to understand what they're going to do? And do you know how you'll respond if an incident occurs? It's very difficult to talk in generic terms, but there's some fantastic advice out there. Transparency International has published a really good guide on what to do if you're asked for a bribe, and I really can't recommend it enough. It's called Resist, and if you go into the internet and search Transparency International Resist, you'll find it. I think there's some other good things that can help you prepare for doing business abroad, and that's looking at, there's some good blogs. The FCPA blog is good. There's an anti-corruption digest email that comes out daily. And if you're looking at these for other global investigations and prosecutions, you'll see some of the risks you're likely to face, and it might just tip you off as to something that you want to do to help prevent your employees and yourself from falling victim to bribery. I think it's difficult, but I think above all, you've just got to try and do the right thing by being prepared. I think that's all I wanted to say, so I'll hand back to Brooke, but I'm looking forward to taking questions later on.
Thank you very much. Could you just, could we have the next slide, please? Just one other resource that I'd like to introduce to you. As I mentioned, I was involved in the B20, this business advocacy group for the G20, and the G20 actually asked the B20 to produce an anti-corruption toolkit for small and medium-sized companies, and this is it. And you can make a note of the URL there. I would say that this is a generic anti-corruption toolkit. It's not specific for British companies going abroad. In fact, I produced this to be adapted to for small and medium-sized enterprises in other countries, and I suppose if I have the resource and the time to do it, I would probably like to do a British version. All the case studies and so on really have to be localized. But in any case, it's not a bad resource, and it discusses some of these questions that bigger companies often take for granted, compliance departments, staff training, and so on, which is usually beyond the scope that many SMEs would be able to deal with. I mean, here we've tried very carefully to to look at it from the point of view of a small and medium-sized enterprise, and in fact an SME not necessarily in the UK but in a developing country which has got even less resource. I should add that this has now been translated and is online in Turkey, Vietnam. There's an Italian version coming out soon. I think there's a version even coming out in Zimbabwe. So, there's some take-up of this in the developing countries, and but you can take a look and you might find some of that useful. Maybe I should ask Will if there are any questions.
Thank you, Brook and Rob, and yeah, we'll circulate any links to useful resources in the aftermath to this webinar, and I'll just put up there briefly, and I'll put up at the end as well contact details for Brook and Rob. We haven't had too many questions in, and we're running slightly low on time, but I'll try and ask a couple. We've had one in from Anthony, and Anthony asks, who can you trust in a country to report a solicitation for bribery? Rob, do you want to start on that and then Brook come in after?
Yeah. Certainly. Who can you trust? Well, it's a very good question, and it's obviously going to vary from market to market. I think the best starting place is if you can't trust the senior people at the business you're doing with, then are they the right people to be doing business with? So I think you'd want to look at the company first. You'd then want to look at local trade associations potentially. And you'd want to look at local law enforcement. Some jurisdictions that's going to be difficult. I think what you need to therefore do is do your due diligence on all of these parties. Research them as much as you can, and there are open web resources on these. There are services that several companies provide in terms of doing that kind of due diligence into your counterparties, into your agents, and into the local individuals. So research, plan as much as you can. Who can you trust? That's going to be a matter of judgment, and you're probably in the best place to make that determination yourselves. But there are certain places you can start and work out from. And if you're finding it absolutely difficult, then turn to the local Foreign Office, embassy, or perhaps people back in the UK to help you support that. And you may even want to talk to competitors. Brook, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's a good answer. I mean, it's a difficult one, and I suppose it also depends on whether you suspect a bribe is going to be solicited or whether it's already been solicited. Certainly, if you've already paid it, then it's a little bit late to worry about that sort of thing. I mean, reporting it after the event is fraught with dangers. I mean, I can't help thinking that the UK Embassy or High Commission in the country where you're operating should be a good place to go to, because in a way they are supposed to have that kind of expertise and support for business. I suppose my impression is that many embassies do have a person who is the right person to do that. Maybe somebody more from the Foreign Office side, I mean from the diplomatic side. Maybe there's usually a prosperity secretary, first secretary, or a commercial secretary, somebody like that, who really should be not only somebody keen on promoting British business, but somebody who's well versed in risk management. What I'm not quite sure about is whether it's consistent across all the British embassies around the world. One of the things that's been discussed, in fact, recently in Parliament, there was there's an all-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption, and this very question was discussed as to whether that resource could really be strengthened. One of the problems is that if there really is an issue and you're deep in it, then if you do go to a public official, a British public official, to either complain or whistleblow or whatever, then that has consequences because, strictly speaking, they're probably supposed to report it on their side, which may not be the best solution. I'd like to also point out another resource which I find quite impressive. It's a website called Business Anti-Corruption. I think it's put out by the Department of International Development. I can see a big EU flag on here as well, so I hope it continues. But in any case, this Business Anti-Corruption portal's got a lot of good tips, and including some country profiles and answers to the really tricky questions.
Thank you, Brooke. We've had a question just in from Peter, and he's asked, if we pay a third party a normal level of commission, but suspect that they might use some of it to pay a bribe, how vulnerable are we? What steps can we take to satisfy ourselves that A, it doesn't happen, B, that we're not exposed? Do you want to reverse this down? Maybe Brooke could go first and then Rob.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question, and it is a question of, first of all, training and making clear that your third party understands what your terms of trade are, and therefore a lot of big companies spend an inordinate amount of time and money on training their third parties. So I mean, if you're looking at it from a big company's point of view, company I worked for a number of years in Russia and Eastern Europe, GE, General Electric. I mean, it was a great big thing training the employees, and that was difficult enough because most of the employees really culturally in those days in the 90s found it particularly difficult to understand what we were going on about. They did think we were slightly mad, I think. But then when you go out to your distributors and suppliers and your third parties and your agents, I mean, they're separate companies, and yet we're telling them that we, the big company, has some kind of responsibility for the way they behave, and we've got some liability in terms of British law in their country. I mean, it's a difficult thing to explain, but explain it you must, and that's a very serious conversation which you have to think carefully about. And I think there are local organizations, local NGOs will have very good materials, I think, to help you do that, maybe even in the local language. So that's one thing. The other thing is to, of course, defend your own back by having an anti-corruption clause in the contract. So you've taken the adequate procedures by the training, but you've also got a very clear clause on anti-corruption that they have to sign up to, and if things go wrong, then at least you can point to the clause. Rob?
I think that's absolutely right, Brooke, and I think I'd go beyond the anti-corruption and building, perhaps, as some of the bigger companies do, a sort of right of inspection. Can you have the right to go out and go out with their sales reps, their agents, and see what they're doing. And I'd also ask for documentation of what it is that their expenditure is going on. Try and get some hard copy evidence, receipts, invoices, whatever it might be, just so that you can demonstrate to anybody who might ask where your money has ended up. I think having it in writing, yes, all sorts of documents can be made up for you, but at least you've tried. You've tried to do the right thing, and I think it's that part of the intent and the culture of your business that concerns law enforcement here, not exactly what happens on the ground. If you've done all you can within your power, then you're doing the right thing.
Thank you both. And just one last very quick question, so we're running very short on time. It's from Kathleen, and she asks, is there a UK government list to screen foreign companies against? Brooke, then Rob, if there's an easy answer to that.
A kind of blacklist, I suppose, I'm understanding. Don't know where that's published. It's a very interesting question. I don't know. Rob, do you know?
I am not aware of one. I think for all sorts of reasons it's the sort of thing a government wouldn't be keen to publish. There is, on the FCPA blog, they have a tracker of all live FCPA investigations, so you'd be able to see what companies are being investigated for bribery and corruption. but that's the only sort of list I can think of in this context. I'm
Well,
not aware of a bad guys list or a black list.
Well, Rob, there's another one which I suppose is that kind of list, which is the World Bank. Now, yes. I mean, it's quite interesting that the international development organizations or international financial institutions, IFIs, like the World Bank, have a blacklist, and they blacklist companies that have been shown to be corrupt and have got up to the funny business in the context of their international tenders. And what's also interesting is that the World Bank and the other IFIs share that blacklist. So if you're blacklisted in one of those, you're going to be blacklisted in the other. So that's actually a very big sanction for a number of companies. And it's not just the companies from the emerging and developing markets that find their way onto the blacklist. There's plenty of very distinguished Western global multinationals and also smaller companies that find their way onto that list. So that first of all is a source of information in answer to your question, but it's also a kind of a discreet warning that if things go wrong, even if they don't go wrong in terms of the UK Bribery Act or the FCPA, you can still be blacklisted on the World Bank and IFI's list, and that also has quite sad consequences.
Yes, I think just to add to that, the only other way of finding that out is to go to some of the subscription services, so like our Insight or DDIQ product or the Thomson Reuters World Check service. You can pay people to check out these individuals for you, and that's certainly one thing that's worth doing when you're doing your due diligence. But I don't think of any open source published list other than the ones we've discussed is there.
Well, there you go. We definitely have run out of time now. So I'd just like to quickly thank Rob and Brooke. Obviously a very challenging and complex topic there. So to have got through that in just about an hour is absolutely fantastic. So thank you, both of you.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much to everybody for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Good afternoon, everyone.
Cool. Thank you. And before heading off, I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to upcoming events being run by the Institute of Export and International Trade, especially Brooke's course on managing risk and opportunities in emerging markets. It's taking place in London on May 25th, and the course will explore many more issues relating to today's topic, with case studies from some of the main emerging markets, role-playing, negotiation simulation, and a lively exchange of best practice, which will hopefully equip exporters to approach the new markets with some renewed confidence. The next Open to Export webinar is on customs compliance risk with XDS Solutions and the Institute's Shipping Office team. 70% of respondents at our recent Export Optimism survey said that they had no plans for dealing with the risks of customs compliance, which is quite an alarming statistic. So this webinar will highlight why you really do need to address this and will give some practical tips for doing so. That's all from us for now. I'll leave this slide running for a few seconds to allow everyone to take note of contact details of the two speakers today, should you wish to. Please also let us know what you thought of the webinar today to give any suggestions for improvements or future topics. So yes, I'll just leave this for a few seconds, and then that'll be all from us for now. So I hope you have a great day, everyone, and speak to you soon.